to a Pixel Talk special presentation. An enhanced reading of The Prince of Nowhere, Part 1.
Hello world. I'm Fivezy, and I want to hear the story about the young prince and the ancient watchtower. It's one of my favorites. Okay Gumball, pull up the episode of Lantern Tales, where Meta Lord Shiloh learns of the young prince.
What about popcorn? Shall I make popcorn?
I don't see why not. How about some hot chocolate, and don't forget a healthy splash of peppermint schnapps for Daddy.
Roger that. I've located the memory from your archives. I'll be right back with snacks.
I remember now. His trusty lantern is telling Lord Shiloh this story. It was essential to his journey around the wondrous mountain for some reason, though I forget why. I have forgotten so many things.
Get your bunny slippers on, and put your feet up. Let's hear the story of the Prince of Nowhere.
The Prince of Nowhere, Part 1. The City. In a kingdom not so far from our world lived a young prince. As the youngest of 7 brothers, the burden of the throne did not weigh heavily upon him. He would learn the royal customs, receive proper education from the Magi, and take a wife and an office within the royal household one day. His low standing provided the boy more time to pursue a life of the imagination. He would often stand upon his toy chest and gaze out his window at all the activity of the realm below with his looking glass. He saw the pleasantries of the royal courts, the puffs of steam rising from the bustling markets of the outer rings, and the gleaming armor of the guards atop the walls extending in concentric circles to the edge of the city. And, in the furthest reaches of the realm, where barely the eye could see, stood his favorite sight, the ancient watchtower. The tower mystified the young prince and set his imagination on fire. With his looking glass he could see that it was built upon a great white rock, tall against the backdrop of many mountains. The stone was ancient, but the gate, hewn from it, seemed more recent. It glittered in the sunlight. The prince marveled at its radiance from the jewels encrusted on its sealed doors. Towering before the gate stood 11 crystal pillars. The pillars rippled light across the desert floor like a golden sea before the mountainous white rock. 10 bright-colored boulders covered the whole rock and laid the foundation for the tower. They fit impossibly tight, with no markings of any tool. Atop them were 25 stones set in the same manner. After these rose 35 more, and 40 more stones of diverse hues atop them. Beyond these, the prince lost count. The rocks above were smaller and uniformly fashioned into squares. Some set proud of the wall, wrapping the tower in a spiral staircase to the keep at the top. As the spire grew, the color of the stones blended into pure white. Some of the stones, however, did not turn bright. Instead, they looked garish, stealing from the radiance of the spire. Moreover, these darkened stones were loosely fitted and looked ready to fall. Some already littered the desert floor, and the boys saw the sparkling shards of a 12th crystal pillar shattered by falling rock. The young prince had never seen anyone near the tower, nor heard of anyone who'd been there. Yet, on clear nights when the top of the spire was not in the clouds, he could see a flicker of light inside the keep by his looking glass. No one could say who built the tower, or why it was there. One would hear rumors of the monolith told like ghost stories around a campfire, but no one seemed to take any serious interest in its history or purpose. His father, the king, spoke of it only once, saying it was abandoned before the time of his father's father, and reminded his son that their kingdom had no threats and no need for a watchtower. He admonished the young prince to forget those things that time had forgotten, and to take a greater interest in his royal studies. His mother also grew tired of his curiosity about the watchtower. She would scold him whenever he brought up the subject, and parrot his father's command to take a greater interest in his role as a prince of the realm. The crowned magicians dismissed his questions about the tower and punished him with added studies about far-flung subjects like the ratios for mixing mortar to fix cracks in the outer walls. The young prince learned never to speak of the tower with the wise men. The prince often spoke of the lights in the keep, which he spied upon with his looking glass. However, no one else could see them, and most couldn't be bothered to look. His mother was none too pleased to learn of his reputation as a half-wit, deluded by fantasies, and doubled his royal duties to keep the boy from distraction. The prince grew into a young man, immersed in preparations for royal life, and while the tower remained, he paid it little attention. Instead, he trained his thoughts on managing the city's outer rings, even though he'd never been allowed to visit them. It was nearing the time when he must choose a wife from among the maidens of the court. The prince resigned himself to his fate, while his mother busied herself on finding a suitable bride. The young prince performed his duties with tepid obedience, but didn't show much passion for the humdrum of the royal house. His lack of genuine enthusiasm angered his mother. The prince sat alone in his room on the evening of the gala. In a few hours, he and other young royals would join in an elaborate ritual to pair them off for marriage. The prince sat alone in his room, dressed in his finest clothing, awaiting the royal attendants to escort him to the great feast. Feeling melancholy toward the evening's events, he walked over to his window to cheer himself with the familiar sights of the realm. He stumbled over the small toy chest, and his childhood looking glass rolled onto the floor. It was much smaller than he remembered, though finely crafted with rich, arcane markings. He picked it up and peered out the window. It was a beautiful, early fall evening. The air was crisp, and the sky was clear. In the twilight shone a full yellow moon, still fat on the horizon. Through the glass he saw all the familiar sights of the realm, the royal court's festivities, the guards' gleaming armor, and the puffs of steam rising and disappearing like little clouds from the outer rings. And there, at the edge of night, stood the tower. The prince's melancholy was gone, replaced by wonder big enough to fill the black silhouette of the tower. He traced its moonlit edges with the looking glass until he saw the familiar flicker of light coming from its crown. His heart soared as a long-forgotten reverie rushed back in. He heard the knock on the door. The royal party had arrived to fetch him. He dropped the looking glass in his pocket. Adventurous thoughts of climbing the tower branded his heart like hot irons. After tonight, the young prince knew that escaping the city would be impossible. His every waking moment would be in preparation for his upcoming marriage and royal duties. The door opened and the Queen Mother and her entourage entered the room. He wore a splendid cloak of blue and silver embroidered with tiny diamonds and sapphires of rare clarity. His mother ran her hands over the jacket to smooth out the remaining wrinkles. His dress was impeccable, but his face was flush from his trance. She scowled at him and spoke curtly to her youngest son about his demeanor. They whisked the young prince down the spiral steps through the grand hall and out to the courtyard. The night was young, and the royal garden was ablaze with firelight, which danced off the sequined garments worn by the great royals. The musicians were in mid-swing, the smell of roasted meats filled the air, the wine was flowing, and something like a plan began to form in the prince's mind. The fall gala was one of only 2 times a year when the royal gates of the city were open to the outer circles. The king invited many throughout the realm to join the celebration and witness the coronation ceremony for their new royal couples. The festivities went on all day, and a few guests who'd outpaced their appetites lay slumped against the castle walls. His mother was distracted in polite conversation with one of the nobles when the young prince ducked into the crowd. grabbing the soiled cloak of an unconscious reveler. Then, assuming the manner of a drunken fool, he stumbled towards the outer gate of the royal courts. A fight broke out in the crowd. Someone shoved the prince face first into a royal guard. He was sure he would be recognized, but the guard pushed him aside and made his way into the crowd to break up the skirmish. The young prince slipped past the royal gate and into a circle of the city he had only known through his studies. No one paid him any attention as he made his way through the bustling crowds to the city's lowest and most extensive circle. His journey took him many hours into the night, and the sun would not be long in rising. No doubt his mother had noticed his absence shortly after his escape. A party of royal guards would be searching for him by now, and daylight would bring them an increased chance of success. The prince shuddered at the thought of what a foolish thing he'd done, and a mild terror crept up his spine as he realized how alone he was in the lower city's vast, stinking mess. Hot steam rose from open sewers, flowing in hewn trenches off the sidewalks. Moisture evaporated from the mossy walls by the flame of crude torches, and the kitchens of street vendors all colluded in the thick, oily mists that filled the air. High in the sky, the moon was a bone-white dot of cold, putrefying light. The young prince, exhausted and unsure how to escape, collapsed against the damp castle wall, tears streaming from his eyes. He drew himself into his filthy and stinking cloak, but could not keep out the cold. Ahead of him stood a man in a tattered covering like his own. Through his tears, the man looked a kaleidoscopic vision in the refracted firelight. The man hid his face beneath his hood. Still, a twinkle of moonlight shone from his eyes and bore straight through the prince. Those awake at this hour shuffled past the man while he remained motionless, holding what looked like a small rusk of bread. He reached for the bread from a primordial hunger deeper than his stomach, and the man was instantly near him. The prince flipped his hands palm open, crossed right over left to receive the bread, and the man spoke. "You must not eat this bread until you get where you are going." "You mean the tower?" the prince exclaimed, and he cast his eyes upon the top of the spire peeking out far beyond the wall, then dropped his gaze to the rusk in his hands. But the bread man was gone, so he put the rusk in his pocket, found a few coins, and used them to buy a popkin from a nearby baker's stall. He ate the greasy pie in 3 bites, and his belly warmed like a small furnace. He walked towards the gate, hopping over the trickle of foul, greasy water which ran between the stone pavers, occasionally surging with fresh dispatch. The people of this circle lived in small huts, caked against the wall like swallows' nests, and in front of them were market stalls for their meager businesses. His heart sank like a stone upon seeing the gate at the entrance to the city. The doors were thrice his height, and made of thick oak, banded and spiked iron. Large chains anchored by heavy gears kept the doors shut. It looked like no one had opened them in ages, and why would they? The prince thought to himself. The city had all it needed within its walls, even if all it needed was the vast poverty surrounding it. The thought occurred to him that the world outside might be terrible, uninhabitable, or filled with monsters with which no man may contend. The prince knew little of the outside world. The court magicians never spoke of it, and the rumors were too dull to be remembered or too terrible to be believed. But curiosity awoke in the prince, adding to his resolve. He must see the world beyond these walls, and the tower after that. He had little time and no idea how to escape the city. The gates were closed and heavily guarded. The sun would be up soon, and he knew the royal guard was not far behind. Leaning against the wall, he watched the gates from a short distance away, hoping for an opportunity. Unfortunately, none came, and the prince dozed off. Something wet and warm bristled against his leg. He awoke, biting his hand to hold back a shriek. He cleared the sleep from his eyes just in time to see the naked pink tail of the creature scurry off into the dark streets. Tempering his disgust, he watched a large rodent disappear between the stones of the Great Wall. The guards also noticed and remarked in disgust. The prince considered this, snatched a large natty hide along with a tan leather whip from a nearby stall, and disguised himself as a very, very large rodent. The prince bumbled across the street, mimicking the rodent, so as not to draw much attention. He was nearing the wall when he heard a guard crudely remark about the creature's size, jesting to the archers above to make target practice of the beast. The prince was alarmed that his decision could cost him not only his life, but that of the guards once they discovered that they'd murdered a prince of the royal house. It took everything in him not to speed up, but he knew the guards would notice and blow his cover. He felt an endless moment of silence, wondering if the archer's arrows were taking aim. Then, finally, a guard called out as he reached the wall, saying to leave the creature alone and that the cleanup would not be worth the kill. From beneath the hide, the prince slid his hands into the large crack in the wet black stone and pulled himself into the tight void. His disguise shrugged from him like skin molting from a serpent. He wondered how long it would take for the guards to notice the remains. All was total darkness as he shimmied into the wall, an inch at a time. As the crack narrowed, the stones tore at the remains of the shabby cloak he'd stolen to disguise his royal attire. He felt the bristle of fur and the scratch of claws crawling over him. He did not think it possible to pull himself back, only forward, and the fear of being stuck there began to drown his hope. He put feelings of revulsion behind him by fixing his imagination on the tower, its crown adorned by the starry host. This vision drew him forth until the midnight blue of his dream gave way to the dark shapes of the ancient stones hemming him in on all sides. The sharp cool of the air outside began to tickle his nose as he shifted one arm past his shoulder and began to pull himself forward in an awkward spiral. Finally, the prince dropped to his back on the dewy grass outside the city wall. He lay there, looking up at the starry host from his vision, thanking his stars, for they were the highest thing he knew to thank, and they seemed to twinkle in delight. The prince got to his feet to survey the landscape. To his right was the tower, looming further than ever in the deep black horizon, and to his left the sky was already bruised a deep purple by the coming sun. His royal clothes had survived better than he expected. The metallic threads and the crystal sequins shimmered in a mirror of the starlight. He hugged the wall, knowing that the guards looked out as much as they looked in, and he was now fully exposed. Beyond the bare, rolling wilderness before him lay the trees of a forest he could escape into, but there was no way to cross the distance without being seen or shot. The sky was pink and orange, and the fires of morning kindled. Daylight would reveal the young prince standing near the wall. He could not hide, and he could not run. Yet, the prince felt peaceful, having made it this far. He knew his journey was at an end, as a pale yellow and blue sky filled the eastern horizon. The prince considered ways to answer his mother upon his return, but nothing came to mind. Beneath the light of dawn loomed a cold gray mist. Rays of sunshine dappled the dewy earth, and spirals of steam arose. The prince smiled at his luck and crawled on his belly through the low, icy air. He did not know if this would provide the cover he needed, but it was his only chance to cross the field to the forest. The mists began to thin in the sun, and the prince stood and ran for the forest beyond. He was sure he heard the whistle of arrows from the archers lining the wall. Had he looked back, the sight would have stopped his heart. The prince ran through the clearing, then, tripped by a root at the forest edge, he tumbled down a steep gully. The prince stood and dusted himself off. He looked at the towering trees above, where a canopy of leaves splintered the morning sun into thousands of tiny diamonds. He assumed the guards had seen him, but they were afraid of the wilderness, and he knew they would be cautious about pursuing him into the forest. The stream flowed nearby, and the thirsty prince drank deeply. The cold water pricked his throat like tiny daggers. Well refreshed, this satisfaction served to remind him that he was starving. Feeling the rusk in his pocket, he wondered if now was the time to eat the bread, but resisted the urge. He wanted to rest, but couldn't take any chances. So he began to walk, following the stream. He ate berries from the small bushes which grew along the way. They gave him strength, but did nothing to slay his hunger. The prince followed the bubbling waters under the thick canopy of forest trees. He tried to sleep at night, but deep in the forest, unearthly sounds kept him awake. And when he thought about resting during the day, the eerie silence of the forest haunted him. On the third day, the gully leveled out. The trees thinned, and the stream trickled as the prince entered a vast meadow. The field was full of tall golden grasses waving in the midday breeze, and dotted by wildflowers of red and blue poppies. The dome of the sapphire sky embraced the meadow on every side, and beyond the low, dusty clouds on the horizon was the great and ancient tower, set against a wall of mountains. The young prince reached for his looking glass and scanned the tower. The noon sun and the ambient dust hid the details of the monolith in an impenetrable gray haze. Still, he thought, he glimpsed the glow of light in its keep. The prince, cheered by the sight of the tower and the beauty surrounding him, chuckled. I'm a prince in the meadow of nowhere. And after a short rest, he set out across the tall grass.
What a fantastical story. Did the prince really leave it all behind only to find himself in the middle of nowhere? I wonder what will happen next, Gumball. Will giant sky pirates swoop the boy up into their Tuscan airships? Will the strange noises in the forest turn out to be goblins that tickle his toes until he begs for mercy? Or maybe he finds horrors beyond his imagination at the edge of the meadow.
Stop with the spoilers. I only hope the prince reaches the tower.
His looking glass reminds me of a story from another world. A story that takes place near Dead Horse, Alaska. Do you know the one?
Yes. The story of young Theodora and the terrible world-ending device she discovers. Her adventure is a real doozy and is told in song by the Dirt Poor Robins.
Okay, Gumball. Let's hear a song before we go.
Where are we going? I have no place like a home. I found this remix of the song, Wax Cylinder Sonata, for us to enjoy.
Dum, dum. Dum, dum. Dum, da, dum, dum. Ba, da, da, ba, dum, dum. Dum, da, da, da. Bound beneath the pages, between the lines, the truth lies in the spaces. The gentle winding of the clock hand, automatons have started walking, now from beyond. my magnum opus. My labor must remain unnoticed. Swift as a ghost and blurred out from their focus. A camera for her eyes, this timepiece for her mind. These heirlooms forsaken, reclaimed and made into my grand device. With a wax cylinder sonata.
Thanks for watching. Pixel Talk will return.
Visit Teegla.com for more art, apparel, and things yet to be revealed.
Over there, that's about 14,000 feet. About as high as I'm gonna go today.